ReefDudes is sponsored by Brightwell Aquatics and Bulk Reef Supply.
Today we're going to set up a calcium reactor on the frag tank. Going on, guys? Devin from ReefDudes. So I've actually been managing this whole tank with just the calc reactor now for probably a good 6+ months, and I've actually been super amazed how well calc has taken me. But the last week or so, I found my alk's been starting to drop, and I'm starting to have to supplement it with some alkalinity fairly regularly, so I think it's time to finally put the calcium reactor online. Now, so today we're gonna hook up the calcium reactor. Now you can kind of see back there, I won a Cove CR150 off a Facebook contest like last year. So I've had it sitting there for ages. It's even full of media. I just never bothered hooking it up because the calc reactor was doing so well for me. But today kind of seems like the time we're finally gonna hook it up. So I'm gonna show you guys how I set up the calcium reactor, as well as we're gonna set it up on the GHL controller, so we'll figure out how to program that and get that dialed in. So first things first, I dug up my old regulator and I got my CO2 tank. So we're gonna hook this up. I did plug this in the power supply for it to one of the GHL outlets. And we're gonna get this wired to the tank. Now you generally do wanna be using CO2 proof tubing. I'm actually out of it because it's all in my other tank, so I'm just gonna use some standard issue RODI tubing for now, and we'll replace it down the road just to keep things more efficient and not have that little bit of bleed off. So first, start off with pulling off the old tube, and I have some red RODI tubing laying around, so we're gonna start with this. Now the solenoid I'm using on this one is, I believe it's the American Marine Pinpoint CO2 regulator, and this was actually the original one I had years and years ago, and I eventually got the carbon doser, so I kind of replaced it. So thankfully I still have this kicking around because it's a perfect one to use on the frag tank. For the feed pump, the reactor technically says it doesn't need one, like it can suck on its own. However, I'm still going to use the Versa on it. I find it easier to fine tune and dial in a calcium reactor if you can tweak that flow, just so you can adjust the fluent rate going through it. And at that point, if you're like, oh, my alkalinity is a little low, you just add a couple more mils type of thing, right? So it makes it super duper easy. I'm also going to continue using calc on this. So the calc is going to be mainly for pH purposes and supplementation. So with this, we're going to start really, really low and just add just a little bit a day and kind of see how far that takes us. So on this tank, I have this little bit of a gap here, which is where my RODI sits, and the CO2 tank as well is going to be just in the very back there. Now we'll make sure we give ourselves lots of extra tube and run this over to the calcium reactor. So you can see the reactor is tucked away behind here. For the most part, all the media inside is the two little fishies reborn, and I also have the Brightwell remag inside of it. This is kind of the little flow adjustment, so you can adjust the bubble count. This I'm probably just going to leave it fully open for the gas line, and we'll fine tune it via the little needle nose over there, or we can kind of use them both as a bit of a safety. But so that's going to come in. You can kind of see the bubble count over there. It is a little bit tucked away here, but now generally how this works is you have a recirculation pump. It mixes the water through the two chambers, and as you do that, you're also injecting CO2. So we have our little bubble counter over here. You can see it sucks from the top of it, mixes it into the intake of the pump, and this mixes it through. Right here has a little in, so that's going to be our tank water. So that's going to be what's hooked up to the Versa, and the output of it, I actually had a little dosing line I just removed over to it. That pushes it back to the tank. So it looks really complicated, but it's actually fairly easy. You essentially have a chamber that circulates water, and you inject gas into it. The gas lowers the pH of the water, and from there it's going to melt the media, and you drip that media into the tank, and that is how you dose things. So make sure we have lots of extra tube. I always like using the tube cutters. It just makes it nice and easy. And the next one, we're going to have our feed pump for it going into the reactor. So we're going to need to pull from the bottom of our sump chamber. Now this one's actually going to go to the intake of a Versa, so it's going to suck from the bottom of the sump, go through the Versa, and then we're going to let the Versa push it through the reactor. Alright, so we have the Versa installed. Now this is going to take a little while, so I'm going to let it start filling the sump, or filling the reactor with water, and I'll go grab a couple buckets and kind of replace some water in the sump to give it that headroom. And for now, we'll just turn it to continuous, and we'll turn it pretty high right now, 200 mils per minute, so it should be pretty fast. And we'll let it start to fill. Alright, so this baby's running close to full speed and should take a little while to fill up that reactor.
So as I was filling this, it actually started to leak. So I had a leak coming from around the side second chamber. So I've been soaking up with the towel, and it was this O-ring wasn't sitting flush in there. And I was fighting this thing for the last like 10 minutes. And I finally just actually thought about this, and this worked out really well. So I got the little like lubrication stuff that came with the Versa replacement tubing. So I put some of that on there, and actually it's sticky enough to hold it in place. So now it should actually hopefully seal properly this time. So yeah, little tip and trick if you're fighting with an O-ring to get it seated properly. All right, so the reactor's running. We checked for leaks. All we gotta do now is plug it in. And now the next step is gonna be to get our pH probe working. So I got a double junction Neptune probe that we're gonna install on this. Now meanwhile, I do have the calibration solutions floating in the tank just to get them warmed up to tank temperature. So now we wanna calibrate our probes. So we're gonna hit one of the arrow keys. Sensor settings, and this is an add-on card, so should be pH value 3. Go down to calibration. All right, so first calibration value for 4. So grab our pH 4 packet. All right, let's pull the cap off, so give a quick rinse in RDI water just to get off into that storage solution. Open our pH 4 packet and set the probe inside. I usually give a little tap just to make sure you're getting air bubbles off and kind of put it in the kitty corner of it. Now hit the check mark. And the second one's gonna be 7. So electrical fluid with 4. Yep. Now please wait. Now we'll wait until the number settles out. All right, so we had our 3 beeps, which means it's settled. So set that aside, give the probe a rinse in RDI water. Give it a quick wipe, and now we'll put it into our pH 7 solution. Again, give it a little shake, and hit the check mark. Now we wait for it to settle again, and then once it hits the 3 beeps, we're done. All right, 4 beeps, we're done. Do you want to save? Yes, we do. All right, so we are done calibrating. So now we're ready to put the probes into the calcium reactor and finish setting it up. And most calcium reactors have a port right in the top. This one has a little red plug in it that we're gonna pop out and slide the probe in. So all that's left is to plug it in, let it recirculate, and then hook up our CO2. All right, so everything's hooked up and running. Water is flowing through it. We just plugged in our solenoid, but now we actually need to program it. So what we're gonna do is we wanna go down to our pH number 3. So pH number 1 is the main pH of the tank. Number 2 is what I actually have the Alcatron hooked up to get in my elk rating. And for number 3 is going to be the calcium reactor. So description, let's just call it pH CRX. Save values, yes, want to log it. Nominal value, so this is what you want it to be set to. So we're going to say, let's do 6.7 for now. Hysteresis is kind of like the window it can swing, so this means it will be 6.67 to 6.73. Okay, so we got pH valve set up. Now we need to set our outlet to be pH controlled. So if we go into our switch channels, the one that the UV used to be on is the one that I hooked up the solenoid to. So we'll go to, once this loads, okay, so switch channel 5 for UV. Let's change this one to CO2. And function, if we go to pH value 3, control, pH control decrease, that should be what we want. So if we say save, I just heard it click on. Now it's just a little bit of a secondary check. You can kind of see the air working its way down there, and it'll bubble up every few seconds. And that's kind of the skimmer's built-in bubble counter. So between the two, it kind of gives an idea how to tune it in. Now it is a bit loud right now, it is full of air because cutting that tube let it suck in a ton of air. So it will take a little bit to work that out again, but now we should be able to kick it in and dial it in. So it's now been just over 24 hours since we put it on, and the first step we want to do is kind of compare our elk measurements. So yesterday, around this time, we had about 8.12, now today we have 8.37. So there's about a 0.25 increase in alkalinity. Now what this means is we need to slow down our effluent rate a little bit. So we're gonna hop back over to Mobius and currently have it set at 10 mils per minute. Now we're a little bit high, so we're gonna drop this down. So this is kind of how we tune the reactor, right? So our elk is raising a little too much, so we want to drip in a little bit less elk to the tank. So let's try setting this at 8 mil. We're gonna hit save. And now basically all we do is wait 24 hours from now, and then we'll test our alkalinity again and we'll see what the result is. And if it's the same as what it currently is, then our reactor is dialed in perfectly. And if it's not, then it means there's a little bit of a swing or up or down, then we got to tweak it accordingly, right? So if your alkalinity is rising, dose a little bit less. If your alkalinity is dropping, dose a little bit more. Simple as that. Okay, so 8.37. So I'm going to check this again tomorrow and we'll see where we're at. Now, one other thing that we got to check on here, just to kind of tune it a little more. So since I have a pH probe in it, the GHL is turning the solenoid on or off based on the value. And if we click into the graph for it, you'll see it was kind of like going up and down a bit. So it was dropping down, the probe was like, oh, too low, turned it off, rose back up, oh, too high, turned back on. So that's what it's supposed to do. That's kind of the safety feature. Now, I also like to tune it in a little bit more so there's less cycles on it and it keeps pretty stable just on its own. So we go into the chart, we should be able to see those little peaks and valleys. So now that this step isn't required because the probe and solenoid are really doing the work, but if you dial it in so it just constantly stays on, there's less wear and tear on the solenoid, less wear and tear on the outlet, and I find that's kind of just a little bit better for longevity. You can do it. So there you go, we still are on and off cycles. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lower the bubble count a little bit so it goes a little bit slower and it shouldn't rise as fast and hopefully, or drop as fast, and hopefully we'll get that nice line right in the middle. So it's pretty easy to tweak a calcium reactor. Of course, you don't really have to do that little bit of tweaking if you have the probe and a controller, pH controller, but it's one extra step that I like to do. So we'll get this tuned in and we'll check back in a day or so and see where we're at. Now it's been a few days since the last clip and I've been letting things settle out and see how everything goes, and you can see the calcium reactor is pretty stable now. There's a slight drop, so I'm going to up the fluent flow just a little bit, but if we take a look at the last few days, we got 8.22 12 hours prior, 8.25 prior to that, 8.39, 8.31, 8.45. So it's a very, very slow little drop in it. So for there, we're going to open Mobius and just up the effluent flow just a smidge, and I think that should pretty much dial it in. So the setup was actually pretty easy with it, and do not be intimidated by a calcium reactor. You basically just have to test it, test your tank, wait 24 hours, test again. If your elk is dropping, up your effluent flow a bit, right? And so really, really easy. And if it's too high, drop your flow down a little bit. So it's super duper easy. So right now I have 7.5 mil per minute, so I'll put it back to 8 mil, hit save, adjust it. Yeah, I was actually surprised how easy it was to set up on the GHL. I kind of assumed it would be a little more involved, but that was fairly straightforward. And yeah, tuning this actually hasn't been bad at all. It's only been a few little tweaks. Now, you do not need a pH controller, but it makes it easier. If you don't have a pH controller, you need to be testing the elk of your effluent a little more often and to kind of get it dialed in stable. So if you have an aquarium controller like an Apex or a GHL or a Hydros, or you can get the standalone Milwaukee one, I mean, that is the easiest way to do it. Now, right now I borrowed a regulator because my original one was being super flaky. I did order the carbon doser, which is definitely a premium one. That one is nice because it is ultra precise. You can dial it in to like a super consistent bubble count. And with that, it'll make it really easy to keep it rock solid stable pH inside your reactor. Now, if you have an aquarium controller or a pH controller, you do not need that. But if you don't have one, then I think it's really valuable to get something like the carbon doser. And if you have both, well, then you got the best of both worlds.
The one thing I would recommend getting is a continuous duty pump. Whether it be the Kimura or my pick would be the Versa, but one of the two of those would be the two I would look at. And having that consistent flow rate makes it really, really easy to dial it in and adjust your alkalinity up or down and keep things super stable. So that's kind of the basis of it. So calcium reactors really aren't that intimidating. When you're dialing it in, take a couple days, take your time, you know, test, wait 24 hours, test again, and just do slow little tweaks. Like, remember, don't do anything fast. Now, there is another option. You could have a steady drip rate through it, and you could adjust your elk by raising or lowering the pH inside of the reactor. So the lower the pH inside of the reactor, so if it's, say, you know, 6.5 or 6.4, 6.3, the lower that is, the more mead you're dissolving, which means the higher the elk of that effluent you're dripping into the tank. So there is going to be a certain point where you'll be dripping and dripping and it won't be able to keep the pH inside stable, and then at that point you're going to have to use a little more CO2. But for all intents and purposes, I find it way easier to just pick a number, you know, 6.5. On my big tank, this one I have at 6.7. Leave it there and then just adjust your effluent and it will be super duper easy to dial in. So hopefully that helped you guys out. If you have any questions at all on calcium reactors, let me know in the comments below. Or setting up on the GHL or any other questions. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you did, as always, hit that like button. If you're new, make sure you subscribe and I'll catch you on the next update.